Welcome to Points of View, a discussion of issues regarding persons with disabilities, moderated by Doug Usiak.
Today's panelists are Melissa Golpl, Disabilities Rights Advocate for Independent Living of Niagara County; Todd Vaarwerk, Director of Public Policy for Western New York Independent Living.
Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the Americans with Disabilities Act 20 years later. Most specifically, what's commonly referred to as Title II, state and local government. And we'll start with the discussion here, Todd. What are we talking about when we're talking about state and local government? Give us an overview of what this Title II is.
Well, Title II is technically called public entities. And what we refer to when we talk about public entities is any element of a state and local government or a state instrumentality. So it could be anything from a village or a town government to a public school system to a public transit system to a state correctional system to anything up to but not including the federal government, because they have their own law.
Now, it brings into the second question here, Melissa, is that, prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act under the Rehabilitation Act as amended from 1973, this famous Section 504, where no otherwise qualified handicapped individual will be denied participation in the benefits of a program receiving federal funds. So why would we need a separate law to include these various levels of government?
Because 504 only covered entities that were recipients of federal funds. Not all state and local governments receive federal funds. So in those discussions that came up in situations where state and local governments were involved, and Todd uses this saying quite a bit, politicians and our elected officials like to reuse things. They don't like to have to recreate, or they don't like to have to create something from original if it's already been done. So basically, all levels of government should be able to reasonably accommodate individuals with disabilities, and that's what the ADA Title II.
Title II comes from a place where Section 504 is just recycled and said, whether you get state or whether you get federal money or not, you're going to have to do this.
Right.
But is there really any state government that doesn't get federal money?
In terms of public entities, there might be some small villages or public transit authorities or instrumentalities like a water authority or a power authority that would be eligible for Title II that don't get federal money.
Now, when we're looking at the impact of this Title II as it relates to the various services and or programs, what is it covering? Is it just covering physical access?
Well, it's covering programmatic access. That's one of the things that still after 20 years kind of confuses people, is that difference between physical access and program access. Physical access, and we use the two examples, if you've got 6 blockbusters in a community, ideally under Title III, which is place of public accommodations, each and every one of them has to be accessible. They're taken kind of on their own as independent businesses. But if you're looking at that same community that might have 3 police departments, the standard for Title II is much lower. They have to make sure that the services can at least be provided by 1 police department and that the community knows which substation to go to get their services.
They look at programs in their entirety.
Yeah, not each individual building or site or location.
So, well, it still confuses me. So the person with a disability's got to figure out which police station to run to for help?
Well, it needs to be publicly available information. It isn't something that they're supposed to be able to figure out. But nothing in Title II, for example, requires them to make a physical change to a building if a programmatic change can be made by moving that service to an accessible location.
And if they're calling a police department, say in an emergency, the whole entire 911 system should be accessible. And that needs to be publicized.
Right, and that is both the parts of Title II and IV, which is the 911 system. But the example is program access instead of individual access. It's the program as a whole, not the individual parts of the program that they measure as accessible or not.
So what covers the other aspects of access other than just program access?
Well,
Are we talking about another aspect of the Americans with Disabilities Act or a whole nother law?
well, no, the Title II pretty much covers it because Title II requires every local government to both designate a person to make sure that program access is assured, whether that's by moving stuff to a accessible location or building ramps or taking care of how those services are provided. A person is to be designated even after 20 years. They still need a designee to make sure that that happens. And when the ADA was first passed, they had transition plans. You're supposed to do a self-evaluation, and based on the self-evaluation, if your government was large enough, you wrote a transition plan to deal with all the things that were pointed out in the self-evaluation. If it's subsequently determined that there's something that's inaccessible that they haven't dealt with in 20 years, they have to do the self-evaluation again. They got to go back to figuring out how those programs or services will be accessible to them.
So the burden within the state and local government is to create a whole nother position in order to take a look at these services and programs?
No, designating a person doesn't mean creating a position. Depending upon the local town or village, it could be someone from the Corporation Counsel's office or someone from their Equal Employment Opportunity office. Positions they have now, but in addition to that, an additional responsibility is added to make sure that they're the coordination point for access issues for services provided by that public entity.
And once they identify, create this directory, this registry, this deficiency list of whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, the self-evaluation.
A self-evaluation,
transition
but
plan.
what do they then do with that material?
Well, ideally, it should be publicly available. We have seen some communities that have really made their self-evaluation and their transition plan important parts of community integration. And we've seen some people that created the document and put them in a closet and never see to be heard from again. It's really hit or miss in terms of enforcement. And the reason why we're talking about this 20 years later is because the ADA still remains a consumer-enforced law. It's us that questions our government to make sure that our rights are being protected. There are no such thing as the ADA police coming down and saying, well, you know, we caught you, you have to do this. The Department of Justice does some of that, but not.
But don't these self-evaluations get filed with the federal government or placed somewhere?
Originally, when the ADA passed, it did. Now, because the transition plans were only supposed to last for like 5 or 6 years, now 14 years after the expiration of the transition plan, most of what happens from the DOJ standpoint comes from complaints.
DOJ being the Department of Justice.
Right.
We'll take a break here. When we get back, we'll look a little deeper into what Todd was mentioning about the consumer enforced aspect of this particular law. See you after the messages.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Do you need to communicate with your customers, sales force, or employees? Do you need a video, website, CD, DVD, or PowerPoint presentation? Then look no farther than the video and multimedia artisans at Creative Concept Studios. From attention-getting TV commercials to unique trade show and corporate events, from digital video production to website design, Creative Concept Studios, mastering the art of communication. Call 887-3800 today for your free creative concept.
Welcome. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and most specifically, we're talking about state and local government and how they need to comply. Earlier in the show, Todd, Melissa, we mentioned the fact that this is a consumer-enforced, and I believe actually off camera, Melissa, you mentioned the word civil law. So what do we mean by that?
Well, and I think Todd mentioned about how there is no Department of Justice police that comes in when they receive a complaint and tell a state or local entity that they must do this. The Department of Justice finds out when state and local governments aren't doing what they're responsible to do under these respective laws when they receive a complaint. And I think that generates a good deal of our business because as a technical assistance provider, we work with everyone in the community to educate and bring awareness to these issues and their respective laws. We're not lawyers and we don't represent people when they're exercising their rights, but we'll show people how to exercise their rights. And one of the things that we do is educate our customers about how their state and local governments work and that they can actually ask their local government, who is the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator? I think usually they're called ADA or 504 coordinators for the municipality. And we'll assist them in the process. We'll show them what they have to do. And sometimes it does rise to the level where they might want to seek out legal representation.
But most of the time not.
Most of the time not. Usually it's either a lack of information or a misunderstanding, or we can provide a recommendation for what a reasonable accommodation could be.
Let's back up a bit. If a person in the community with a disability is having some difficulties or some issues in accessing a program or a service, and I believe that's what we're talking about, from their local municipality, they more than likely, I would suspect, are unaware that there are various laws or regulations that provide a guidance
Yes.
to what needs to be done?
Or a way to open discussion about how a reasonable accommodation would be provided.
So what type of issues are people actually seeing out there with their local governments?
You'd be and one of the things about this, and which is why we thought it was important to do this show, is to kind of list some of the things in Title II that are happening now that people wouldn't necessarily think are an issue for state or local government. We're seeing problems with state and local governments promoting programs in their communities that they bid out to others. Concert series, street fairs, those kind of things that they're offering to everybody, but they forget that they have a requirement to make sure that the event is reasonably accommodated for disabled people to attend. For example, plays at a local performance venue without interpreters, or the lack of accessible bathrooms at a street festival. It's just as much the responsibility of the local government to make sure that stuff is provided as it is for the entity that they contract to or that they allow to come in and provide the service.
Okay, so one could understand the fact that if the local government's going out there and hiring some type of outside entity, agency, organization to come in and provide entertainment. But what type of issues are you seeing within the everyday governmental services and programs that people are facing now?
Simple things like not being able to get a Braille property bill or a Braille water bill, not being able to get an interpreter at a public city council meeting, not being able to get appropriate reasonable accommodation services for a public transit authority. All of those folks are covered under Title II. Parents having problems getting reasonable accommodations from their children's school because they're parents with disabilities. Those are the kind of things that we're seeing.
So a school district, Melissa, would be covered under Title II?
Yes, they are.
In all the various services and educational programs, or what?
Yes, they are.
By way of example, if you place a requirement on parents in a school district that they have to be with their kids at the bus stop because the kids are too young to be by themselves, and you've got a person with a disability who, because of their disability, can't get there and wait with their kids, they have a right to ask the district for a reasonable accommodation.
For the parent?
For the parent, to move the bus stop closer to the house, or to change the bus route to allow the parent the full level of participation.
So is the educational program itself also under Title II?
No, the educational program itself for a student with a disability would be the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
or it would be covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973,
As amended.
as amended.
It's amended. It's been amended more than once?
Yeah. Original regulations came out in '78.
Now, when we're looking at the various state and local, we're talking, you mentioned if there's special events that are being done. I believe you might have mentioned the water facility, if it's governmental controlled. Or would something like that that's done by, the words aren't coming to me right now, when it's outsourced to a private entity, privatized,
Contracted?
when it's privatized, or contracted.
No, it applies to contractors as well, and the contractor cannot say that they don't have to meet the requirements. It's the governmental entity's responsibility to make sure that the contractor is aware of their obligations.
And meets them.
And meets them, because they are responsible.
Even if there's a contract in place.
It's called the lessor-lessee provision. Both parties are responsible for making sure that the accessibility of the program or service is provided. Whether it's both parties that's responsible. So the government can't get out of it by saying, we contract that out to X company, it's their job to do. And then the company can't turn around and say, no, we just perform the service for the city. If you have a problem with that, go talk to them. I mean, we hear about that all the time.
Yeah, so fire halls definitely, when contracted out, would have to come into play.
Yes, would have to come into play with Title II, yes.
And the individual that the community resident would contact, would they go to their mayor, or their council member? I mean,
They could ask of those individuals who they should be directed to. Generally, any state or local governments, there should be a designee. I mean, that's part of the requirement.
Yeah, and the designee's got to be publicly posted and made publicly available. So you're supposed to be able to find that person easily. Okay. If for some reason you can't, that's a really great reason to see your advocates at your independent living center.
and I'm going to stop you there, Todd, because when we come back right after these words, we're going to talk about what type of assistance is out there for those small towns and various government entities that need some help in meeting the Americans with Disabilities Act. See you in a couple seconds.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Do you need to communicate with your customers, sales force, or employees? Do you need a video, website, CD, DVD, or PowerPoint presentation? Then look no farther than the video and multimedia artisans at Creative Concept Studios. From attention-getting TV commercials to unique trade show and corporate events, from digital video production to website design, Creative Concept Studios, mastering the art of communication. Call 887-3800 today for your free creative concept.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and most specifically, Title II, the state and local government element of it. And as I understand, Melissa, when we talk about the state and local government, that the fact that it's a civil law and that the individual within the community or the consumer or the citizen needs to be the person to evoke that there's a problem to the greater authority. And in that case, I suspect the greater authority would be the federal government in order to try to remedy that or to pursue some type of judicial settlement. But in the case of ignorance within the town, village, county, what is out there to assist our various legislative leaders locally who understandably aren't aware of what's out there for people with disabilities and what can actually happen to make the town better for the person with a disability? Where do they go? Where do they find help?
They could actually come to their local independent living center. We are technical assistance providers. We work with everyone. when I work with any customer that comes to ask questions or seek guidance on exercising their rights, I always tell them, we don't take sides. We will assist people in the process if they choose to use a system and exercise their rights, but we are bridge builders. We're advocates and educators. That technical assistance is applied with everyone. We will help explain rights to people, we'll explain processes that they can use, avenues that they could pursue, but we'll work with our local governments. We actually are working with several local municipalities, and we educate. I think that's the biggest thing that we do.
Yep. And the other thing is, we want to do a little bit of rumor busting, because we think that most Title II problems that are related directly to the municipality before they're reported to the feds can be solved quickly and easily with collaboration. Even if there isn't an independent living center nearby, the federal government's provided ADA centers, which used to be called Disability and Business Technical Assistance Centers, for local governments to come to get advice and referrals to local agencies who can help them resolve Title II problems. For our neck of the woods within the viewers of this program, that program is located at Cornell University.
Now, where do you, Melissa, you call yourself a technical advisor, where do you as individuals from independent living centers, where do you get your expertise from?
Actually, Todd and myself are both certified ADA trainers from the Northeast ADA Center, which is at Cornell. Many of our experiences in our life situations contributes to what we know.
Yeah, it's the peer relationships in terms of learning to use the ADA over pretty much the entirety of its lifespan, and even knowing people who were involved when they were creating it. I mean, every conference we went to for the longest time talked about the ADA. And the more you use it at home, the more you see how it works at home, the easier it is as a person with a disability to use that to get what it is that you need without, feeling the need to threaten a lawsuit every 5 minutes. One of the biggest urban legends is this whole thing that, all these disabled people, all they want to do is sue because they want to get money, and then they want to go away.
Yeah, but would it be wrong for a municipality to pull together their own residents or citizens to sit down and to identify the best way to pursue an issue that may initially be inaccessible to them?
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, one of the best practices that's being identified are communities that put together those advisory councils who involve themselves in the creation or an update of a self-evaluation or a transition plan. And they talk about what needs to be done first and what needs to be done next and what needs to be done next.
Well, what happens if it ever happens, that the committee, the advisory group, actually wants it one way and it might not be meeting whatever the code may be for that? I mean, does that create a problem?
Well, there's two sides to that, Doug. One is, remember that the ADA is a floor, not a ceiling. The ADA is the minimum we must do, not the maximum we can do. A community's citizens certainly can advocate for a higher standard for that community to take. There's nothing in the federal law that says that you're not allowed to go above the ADA. However, I think it would be very unlikely for a bunch of consumers to advocate for something that doesn't meet ADA standard. If a city government or any public entity actually is caught in that kind of a situation where they followed the advice of their customers and it turns out that what their customers didn't know was the minimum ADA standard the community had to meet, that would go right back into technical assistance. We'd take that as an ignorance question and we'd move to correct it.
Now, what are the more common issues that you have seen that you're working with in order to possibly, for anybody who may be watching from a local government, that you deal with frequently, that they may be able to find some assistance from?
From a public entity standpoint, it really is things that are basic. I mean, starting with making sure that your services and programs are in accessible buildings. looking at parking, looking at doorways, looking at counter heights, looking at being able to find where that ADA coordinator is and making sure they're in an accessible office is key. The other thing that we've found, and which we find very illuminating, is training on the ADA for employees of local governments. If they all know what the standard is, they're going to work together to catch stuff before the customers do. And we've been very successful in collaborating with local governments to get that training in the hands of people that you wouldn't necessarily see to get trained. For example, the guy who works for the summer at the Parks Department notices that there's a problem with the accessibility of the bathroom in one of the parks and brings it to somebody's attention.
Now, is this a cost to local government in order to ask the local independent living center for help?
There isn't any cost to ask us for assistance at all. There isn't any cost to ask the ADA Center for assistance because they're going to provide information and referral to somebody who's going to be able to help them. I mean, just like everything else, I mean, you could go to places and pay, architectural consulting fees and stuff like that, but the initial assessments as to how to get that transition plan started, none of those locations assess a cost to that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess as we look at 20 years after the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's probably still a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of resources to get that accomplished, as well as contacting your own citizens that have disabilities in your community. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next Points of View. Take care.
Points of View is presented by the New York State Independent Living Council, Incorporated, in cooperation with the Catskill Center for Independence, Finger Lakes Independence Center, Independent Living of Niagara County, and Western New York Independent Living. For the location of the Independent Living Center in your area, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.